From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I give you this personal oath. I have never abused my office, not now, not ever.
The question in New York is whether Governor David Paterson intervened in a domestic violence case involving his top aide. But we'll go larger. We'll look at domestic violence around the country with a survivor, who happens to be the president of the National Organization for Women, Terry O'Neill. Also, a bill in Utah could allow women to be charged with murder if their behavior is deemed to lead to a miscarriage. We'll speak with Lynn Paltrow, Executive Director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. Then investigative journalist Greg Palast travels to Liberia to report on Vulture funds.
Just as Britain, Europe, and America were about to pay off all of Liberia's debts, down swooped vultures who put their claws on the money. They were waving worthless sheets of paper, old debts that they had picked up for next to nothing. And now they were demanding that these Liberians pay them 10 times, even 100 times what the vultures themselves had paid for this worthless junk.
And we'll get the latest from earthquake-ravaged Chile. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 30 people have been killed in 3 suicide bombings in the Iraqi city of Baquba. More than 40 people were wounded. The attack comes as Iraq is on high alert ahead of Sunday's parliamentary elections. A security official at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq has claimed he believes State Department colleagues tried to block any serious probe of the 2007 massacre of 17 Iraqi civilians by employees of the private military firm Blackwater. The official, David Farrington, told prosecutors State Department officials handling evidence at the crime scene wanted to ensure the Blackwater guards would avoid punishment. Charges against 5 Blackwater guards were dismissed in December after a federal judge ruled prosecutors had tried to use testimony that the guards had made under immunity provided by the State Department. According to the New York Times, prosecutors in the case were also concerned Blackwater was trying to obstruct the investigation and had uncovered evidence that the company's management had failed to report testimony from their own guards. One guard who witnessed the Nisour Square massacre described it as, quote, murder in cold blood. The military industry giant KBR has been awarded a new contract worth up to $2.8 billion in Iraq. KBR's work has come under wide scrutiny over several controversies, including the electrocution deaths of U.S. troops due to faulty electrical work, the alleged exposure of troops to cancer-causing chemicals, the alleged gang rape of a female KBR worker, and multiple allegations of contract fraud. A former subsidiary of Halliburton, KBR is the Army's largest contractor in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Israel and the occupied territories, the Israeli government has delayed a plan to demolish Palestinian homes in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Bustan. Israeli officials are pushing to construct an archaeological park on the grounds of homes inhabited by Palestinian families for over a century. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asked Jerusalem's mayor to delay the demolition, citing concern over Israel's international image. Orly Noy, a spokesperson for the Israeli human rights group Iramim, criticized the demolition plans.
We believe that any plan that involves massive demolitions of almost 90 houses in the most sensitive area and the most explosive area of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Jerusalem is extremely dangerous both to the political future of the city and to its current stability.
Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, the United Nations top humanitarian official has accused Israel of keeping Palestinians in an open-air prison. John Holmes appeared on the news network Al Jazeera English Tuesday after touring Gaza.
Yeah, they're living in a kind of open-air prison. They're still suffering this kind of collective punishment they've been suffering for 3 years now. And it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive including for Israel, because it's only breeding despair. It's not helping their objectives, whatever they might be in Gaza. So it really needs changing, and it really needs changing very rapidly. I think that's the main point. And we really hope that they will reconsider the kind of attitude they've been adopting so far.
On Capitol Hill, the Senate has passed a $10 billion spending bill extending unemployment benefits for millions of Americans. The bill was approved after Republican Senator Jim Bunning of Kentucky agreed to end a 5-day filibuster to prevent its passage. Bunning's opposition had forced around 2,000 federal employees into furloughs and delayed several dozen highway projects. Earlier in the day, Bunning defended his campaign against the bill.
We want a country that my 40 grandchildren have the same abilities that I did growing up. We want a country that don't owe everybody in the world for our existence. And the question I've been asked mostly is, why now? Well, why not now?
The auto giant Nissan has announced plans to recall nearly 540,000 vehicles, mostly in the United States. Nissan says the recall would address potential defects in its brake pedals and fuel gauges on at least 4 different models. A new report says the price of insurance premiums has far outpaced medical costs and inflation over much of the last decade. According to Healthcare for America Now, insurance premiums for families rose 97% from 2000 to 2008. During the same period, payments from insurers to medical providers increased only 72%, while underlying medical inflation increased only 39%. Premiums also increased over 3 times faster than wages, which rose only 29%. A new report says the United States is seeing a major rise in the number of domestic right-wing extremist groups. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, anti-government patriot groups grew to 512 in 2009, an increase of 244%. Right-wing militias tripled over the same period to 127. In California, the Los Angeles Public School Board is preparing to warn teachers of massive layoffs amidst a $640 million budget shortfall. On Tuesday, the Los Angeles Unified School District voted to send notices of possible layoffs to up to 5,200 teachers. The Obama administration's announced plans to adopt an alternative formula for measuring poverty in the United States. Under the new approach, expenses including housing, utilities, childcare, and medical treatment will also be factored in. The new standard won't replace the current federal formula, which is based on the cost of food and family income. And the Supreme Court's rejected an effort to block the District of Columbia's legalization of gay marriage. Opponents of gay rights had sought to prevent the district from enacting the law pending an appeal. The first marriage licenses are expected to be issued today. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New York Governor David Paterson is facing increasing pressure from state Democrats to defend his actions or resign in the wake of allegations that he may have used his authority to influence a domestic violence case involving one of his top aides. Last week, the governor announced his withdrawal from the gubernatorial race, but denied committing any ethical breach.
Today, I am announcing that I am ending my campaign for governor of the state of New York. It has become increasingly clear to me in the last few days that I cannot run for office and try to manage the state's business at the same time. And right now, New York State needs a leader who can devote full time to this service. But I give you this personal oath. I have never abused my office, not now, not ever.
A report in the New York Times alleged that Paterson's top aide, David Johnson, now suspended, attacked his girlfriend last Halloween, quote, choking her, smashing her into a mirror dresser, and preventing her from calling for help. On Monday, the New York Times reported Governor Paterson had personally intervened in the case, asking 2 staff members to contact the victim the night before she was to appear in court to request an order of protection from Johnson. She did not show up in court. In light of these revelations, the New York chapter of the National Organization for Women, which has been a longtime ally of Paterson, called on him to resign. As the pressure rises on Governor Paterson, we take a step back to look at the issue of domestic violence around the country. I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Terry O'Neill. She's the president of the National Organization for Women. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Terry. First,
thanks, Amy. I'm thrilled to be here.
It may surprise many that the National Organization for Women, long an ally of Governor Patterson, who has hailed him for his, for his feminism, for supporting women, is now calling for his resignation.
Sure, and the New York State Now chapter made that decision. I'm sure it was not an easy decision for them to make. But the issue of domestic violence is just too important. It's an issue that the National Organization for Women around the country we have worked on for decades, and although it may not have been easy, I think it's the right thing to do.
You, Terry O'Neill, have come out as a domestic violence survivor. Can you talk about how you yourself decided to make your ordeal public and what happened to you?
Sure. Actually, what happened to me happened a very long time ago. I was in my early 20s. I was newly married, and I was, frankly, I suppose in the universe of domestic violence, I was quite lucky. Newly married, the marriage wasn't going well. I told my young husband, you know, we need to get divorced, and I experienced what has later come to be called separation assault, where it was a little bit like the Chris Brown incident, frankly, an assault done by an individual who was using violence to get what he wants, and in my case, it was he did not want me to leave the marriage. I had enormous supports available to me. My parents were living in the same town. I moved into their apartment. So I was able to get into a safe space. I was able to continue working. This individual came to my place of employment only once and never came back again. I had everything going for me. So I was very, very lucky. What I have learned from that experience is that it's crucial that women who are escaping violent relationships must have supports, multiple types of supports. You know, I didn't go public with this until actually fairly recently when I was working for a county government in Maryland, and that county was establishing a family justice center dealing with domestic violence. And at that point, I was working with the sheriff's department, setting up the protocols and so forth, and I thought it might be useful for me to tell them my story. Because I wanted them to be very much aware of the self-image, I suppose, of women escaping violence. The one thing that I remember experiencing in my early 20s was I did not want to be defined by that experience. I repeatedly told my family members, I am not a battered wife. You know, I am a person who may have a career ahead of her. I am a person who is looking at graduate school. It was very important to me to not be labeled as a person who has gone through this experience. So I felt that I could use my experience as the Montgomery County was setting up this family justice center to help keep the awareness of the women who are coming to them for help. These are capable, intelligent women who are juggling an enormous number of challenges, more than most women perhaps need to juggle, and that there's a huge element of, I guess, embarrassment that women need to be recognized for their capabilities and not just for their, if you would, victimization.
Last week on Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid linked rising unemployment to increased violence against women and girls. This is what he said.
I met with some people while I was home dealing with domestic abuse. It has gotten out of hand. Why? Men don't have jobs. Women don't have jobs either, but women aren't abusive most of the time. Men, when they're out of work, tend to become abusive. Our domestic crisis shelters in Nevada are jammed. It's the way it is all over the country.
That was Harry Reid. Your response to that, Terry O'Neill?
Yeah, and you know, Senator Reid is absolutely right to talk about the money. When it comes to domestic violence, I think we do need to follow the money in two ways. First, in a household in which there is unemployment, the risk of domestic violence is significantly higher than in households where there is full employment. For one thing, when an abusive person is not employed, then the person who's being abused has a harder time getting away from him, right? He's home all the time. He may be drinking. She's finding it harder to create her safe plan and her means of exit, to get the kids okay, to find an apartment, to gather up the money for the first month's rent and the security deposit and so forth, all the logistical things you need to do. So he's home because he's unemployed, makes it much harder for her to maneuver around to try to get herself and her children into a safe space. Another piece of the economic issue that's extremely important to remember is that women who are unemployed or underemployed are at significantly higher risk of domestic violence than women who are full-time employed at fair wages. I don't think that it is a stretch to connect the dots between systemic wage discrimination against women, right? Women are paid 78 cents to the dollar. In communities of color, it's much worse. African-American women are paid 64 cents to the dollar for white men. Latinas, it's 58 cents. And the economic security of a woman is very much related to her ability to leave an abusive or violent relationship. So the unemployment situation sort of comes at women with domestic violence issues from these two different perspectives, and I applaud Senator Reid for pointing that out. The thing that I think the next step that we have to make, now that he makes that connection, we must not decrease expenditures on violence against women programs. In fact, when the economy suffers, that's when public policy, I think, requires that we increase services for women escaping violence.
During last week's health care summit at Blair House that President Obama presided over, New York Congressmember Louise Slaughter noted that domestic violence is considered a pre-existing condition in 8 states across the country. This is what she said.
Is the pre-existing conditions absolutely has to go. It is cruel, it is capricious, and it is done only to enhance the bottom line. 8 states in this country right now have declared that domestic violence is a pre-existing condition on the grounds, I assume, that if you've been unlucky enough to get yourself beaten up once, you might go around and do it again.
That was New York Congressmember Louise Slaughter. Terry O'Neill, this is just astounding. Explain again what some health insurance companies consider, how they consider domestic violence a pre-existing condition?
You know, I've never been able to get an explanation of why they do it. I assume it's because it's just an effort. It's one more way of enhancing their bottom line. But it's absolutely astonishing that if a woman who has experienced...
Go ahead.
She can be, right, she can be denied insurance completely. No health insurance available on the private market. If the insurance company says, oh, well, you've been a victim of domestic violence, therefore we're not going to cover you at all. And in 8 states, the insurance company is permitted to say no coverage of anything, right? I don't know where the insurance, I don't know if there, I can't imagine that there are statistical studies proving that somehow it is more expensive to insure a person who has been in a domestic violence situation. Clearly, this kind of pre-existing condition should be outlawed, must be outlawed immediately, and I think that this is a recent phenomenon of insurance companies simply looking anywhere they can for profit, and this is one way they've done it. It's completely outrageous.
I'm looking at a report from ABC News, how they describe the latest controversial abortion bill in Utah meant to prevent planned assaults on unborn children may have opened a loophole that could allow women to be charged with murder if their reckless behavior causes miscarriages. And on that issue, I wanted to bring in a second guest. Lynn Paltrow is the Executive Director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. This is an astounding bill and actually also relates to the issue of domestic violence. Can you explain?
Well, the way the statute is written, any action a woman undertakes knowingly or recklessly can result in a charge of homicide with a penalty of 15 years. So a woman who is pregnant and stays with her batterer is arguably being reckless in staying there. And should she stay there, she could literally be charged with attempted feticide or murder if she survives and the fetus doesn't. And I think your other guests can talk about why women do stay in those circumstances and why making them criminals for doing so is so unjust.
It's really astounding when you play this out, because if a woman is afraid that she might not get health insurance, she won't let people know that this has happened, Terry O'Neill.
Well, sure. She won't let people know that it has happened. It's also the case that women who are in abusive relationships need to think carefully about what their options are, where can they go. There are communities where even if there is a shelter, that shelter is full for 6 months. You can't get in for 6 months. So she needs to gather together the money to move out, to find the apartment. It has to be in a neighborhood that has good schools for her kids and good services for her kids. She needs to be able to find a safe space. She needs to be able to get to a place where he can't find her. She needs to be able to go through the legal process to get the restraining order and the permission. In many states, women who are being battered are not permitted to move to a safer place if it requires her to cross the state line, because he has a legal right to have access to the children. So if she lives, for instance, in Louisiana, as a case I'm familiar with, and a woman who'd been battered and had lost her job in Louisiana, her parents in Arkansas said, come move in with us and you can find a job there. Oh no, she wasn't, that was not an option for her. She couldn't cross state lines because of Louisiana law. So there are all kinds of constraints on women's ability to leave that relationship. And then you have Utah coming in and criminalizing her behavior. How about if we take a step back and look at it from a different perspective and say, let's provide services for women trying to escape violence. Let's provide realistic consequences to men who are violent toward women. We don't have nearly the kind of consequences that we need for men who are violent. And let's begin changing the behavior of the men instead of trying to control the sexuality of the women. The Utah legislator, as I understand it, who put this law in, he was asked, isn't this really, an anti-abortion measure? And he said, listen, I am totally anti-abortion rights. I don't want women to have any abortion rights. And I hope that this measure does restrict women's ability to terminate a pregnancy when they want to. He said, I think the Utah, he obviously is one who believes that the Utah legislature has more right to control a woman's body than the woman herself does.
We're going to continue this discussion, but we have to break for a minute. We're talking with Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women. She's in Washington, D.C., and Lynn Paltrow, founder and executive director of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women here in New York. We'll be back in a minute.
There was a girl I used to know. She was oh so beautiful. She's not here anymore. She had a college degree, smart as anyone could be, had so much to live for. But she fell in love with the wrong kind of man. He abused her love and treated her so bad. There was not enough education in her world that could save life from this little girl. Well, how come, how long, it's not right, it's so wrong. Do we let it just go on? Turn our backs and carry on. Wake up.
How Come, How Long by Babyface here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guest today, Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women, and Lynn Paltrow, founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. Lynn, I'd like you to talk more about the Utah case. Again, summarize what it says, and then it is not alone in this country, Utah, in passing laws that have this kind of effect on pregnant women or considering laws, and I'd like you to go through them.
Well, the Utah law was ostensibly passed in response to a particular event, and that's often how anti-choice and fetal rights legislation gets passed, under the guise of we're just doing this little thing. And this little thing involved a 17-year-old girl who was pregnant, whose boyfriend told her he would leave her if she continued to term. And in some act of absolute desperation, she apparently hired somebody to beat her up, to cause her to lose the pregnancy. She survived, the baby survived. They arrested both the young man who beat her up and the young woman. The young man was charged with attempted feticide, and so was she. But when they realized that they really couldn't apply the attempted feticide law to the girl herself, so outraged were they that they couldn't lock up a 17-year-old for 15 or more years, that they passed a law that purports to outlaw self-abortions. First of all, you know, for people who claim to pass laws to promote a culture of life, it's hard to imagine that when they don't value the life of, also the life of this young woman. Anybody who is so desperate as to invite violence against herself, and she could have died from the beating, to think that a statute making that behavior a crime is going to deter such desperate behavior is pretty crazy to begin with, and lacking in any common sense about if you really want to value fetal life and maternal life, this is certainly not the way to do it. One of the things the law reveals is that for many, many years, those groups who've been trying to overturn Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision recognizing the right to choose abortion, have argued that if Roe is overturned, don't worry, only the doctors are going to go to jail, not the women who, in seeking to control their reproductive lives, have abortions. Well, Utah has just lifted the veil on that, making very clear that women themselves will go to jail, and for at least 15 years, and life in some circumstances. But even beyond that, the law is written so broadly that it applies to any behavior a woman engages in, knowingly, recklessly. And, you know, who gets to decide if what you're doing is reckless is the arresting officer and the local prosecutor, not you, your heart, your minister, those people, and put you in jail. So a woman who is unable to leave a batterer could be charged. Women who, in Iowa, they don't even have a law like this on the books, but a young woman, after having a terrible argument with her husband from whom she was separated, got off the phone and went to go downstairs to see her children and fell down the stairs. She went to the hospital out of concern about her baby, got there, was really upset, hysterical, worried, and they started questioning her. And what they decided was her fall down the stairs was attempted feticide. And they arrested her and kept her in jail for several days until the Iowa county attorney decided that their unprecedented and, frankly, illegal interpretation of the law couldn't be applied to her, but only because she was in her second trimester and not her third trimester. So I think people, when we give examples of women being arrested for staying with a batterer, people think these are slippery slope craziness. But we keep seeing cases like this. In fact, Utah in 2004 arrested a woman who had given birth to twins, one of whom was stillborn, and they charged her with murder because she had refused a C-section 2 weeks earlier. And the theory was her refusal of cesarean surgery constituted murder. So right now there's a law that's been passed by both houses in Utah that would make miscarriages and stillbirths, because it applies to pregnant women from the moment they conceive. One really interesting thing that people need to think about is that people know that if a woman gives birth and then breastfeeds, it's likely to continue the time where she won't become pregnant again while she's breastfeeding. And apparently one theory about why that works is that the hormones, breastfeeding affects the body so that the fertilized egg can implant. That's an abortion. That's self-abortion. So if the state wants to set up a mechanism for policing pregnant women, Utah has done a very good job.
Louisiana?
Well, not Louisiana, but Mississippi. We look across the states. We see that our government is in deadlock about passing health insurance for people, health care reform for millions of people who need it. But state legislators are hard at work, making it harder for pregnant women to access the health care they need, and more likely for them and their health care providers to go to jail. In Mississippi, there was a bill proposed to criminalize certain kinds of midwifery. The problem with that is, as we saw after Hurricane Katrina and after we saw in Haiti, that if your hospital's shut down, you need people who know how to deliver babies without electronic fetal monitors and surgical theaters and even epidurals. So you really don't want to be making it a crime for certain kind of midwives to practice. But if a woman in a disaster area can't access birth services, she also probably can't access abortion services. And we know if she took measures into her own hands in Utah, she could go to jail for life. In Nebraska, legislators, in the name of protecting the unborn from pain, argue that fetuses after 20 weeks experience pain, and their response to that is to outlaw all second trimester, to ban all third trimester abortions, and to put the doctors who perform them in jail, even though to the women who need them, they are heroes. We look at that and we think, really, if you believe that 20-week fetuses experience pain to that extent, wouldn't they also experience pain from electronic fetal monitors put through their scalps, from forceps deliveries, from Pitocin-induced labor? And if your response to fetal pain is to outlaw something, then you're going to also have to outlaw certain kinds of vaginal birth.
One of the participants in the Blair House Obama Healthcare Summit was Oklahoma Senator Coburn. His views on abortion?
Well, he has said that he believes that doctors who perform abortions should receive the death penalty. And in his state, women who experience stillbirths that the state claims was caused by something they did have been charged, in fact, with murder. In every state but South Carolina and potentially Utah, those prosecutions lack any legal support. And if the woman is lucky enough to be adequately represented, eventually, perhaps years after she's been imprisoned, she can get those charges dropped. But South Carolina, as a result of judicial activism, and now Utah, is making it possible to put women behind bars because they are either trying to go to term or because they take desperate measures not to.
Tom Coburn is a doctor and was sued by a woman who charged that he sterilized her without her knowing it, that he had gone in to save her life, really. I think she had an ectopic pregnancy in a fallopian tube, and he removed that, but he removed the good tube as well.
Interesting.
The case ultimately dismissed because she didn't show up in court.
Well, we know more and more as Catholic hospitals become the only hospital in town. There are more and more reports of women who go to those hospitals with ectopic pregnancies. Those are pregnancies in fallopian tubes. The embryo can never survive. It's not a question of an abortion. It's a question of saving the woman's life. And recently we got a call from a woman where she was in agonizing pain. The fallopian tube could explode, putting her life at risk. And the Catholic hospital said, there's still a heartbeat, go home and wait. And so they force women to suffer unbelievable pain or to travel hundreds of miles to a hospital that will treat them as human beings, not as subjects of religious orthodoxy.
Is anti-choice legislation on the rise? Have things changed during the Obama years, or I should say year?
Well, there's no question, and this was unfortunately well predicted, that violence has reemerged. The murder of Dr. Tiller, bombings of clinics, that when the anti-choice movement feels less in power, they increase their violence. It's hard to say if there's more legislation. Every year, hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation in the state legislatures are proposed to regulate abortion. And I want to point out that what that means is that all of the other issues of concern about women's health, breast cancer, heart disease, the rising rate of unnecessary C-sections, none of that gets addressed because our state legislators will only focus on women's issues if they are about restricting in a greater way access to abortion. What I think may have changed is a rise in a more openness about what they're really trying to do. And what they're really trying to do is, in the guise of barring harm to unborn children, and sometimes they claim harm to pregnant women, what they're really doing, as in Utah, is trying to put pregnant women behind bars.
Finally, Terry O'Neill, as you listen to this discussion on what pregnant women face around the country, the overall issue of how the state deals with women dealing with violence. You talked about training police, sheriffs around domestic violence. Your final comment.
Well, yeah, I think we need far more resources put into programs that end violence against women. And let me just say one thing that Lynn Paltrow said. You were asking about laws around the country and anti-abortion laws. Even in the United States Congress, in the current health reform laws, we have seen both the House of Representatives and the Senate insert language into the health reform bill that would eventually to a near certainty, eliminate private insurance coverage for abortion care as well as public. The Senate bill takes a little longer to fully eliminate all private insurance coverage of abortion care. The House bill does it a lot more quickly, but both have the same ultimate result. So it's not just in the states; it's in the United States Congress as well. In terms of ending violence against women and ensuring that women have control of their own bodies, I think one of the things we really need to look at is who's in charge here. We have 17% of the United States Congress as women. That's not critical mass. It certainly isn't half, and women do account for a little over half of the population of the United States. 5 of the United States Supreme Court justices need to be women. Period. End of discussion. At minimum 4. Currently, only 2 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are women, and I think that that women, if we are going to have equal rights, and if we are going to be respected equally as human beings on the same basis as men, we've got to get into positions of elected officials, and we've got to become the judges of this country. Because right now, with male-dominated legislatures and male-dominated and often right-wing-dominated federal courts, we are really seriously being pushed backwards in our rights and our access to justice.
Terry O'Neill, I want to thank you very much for being with us, President of the National Organization for Women, and thanks, too, to Lynn Paltrow, Founder and Executive Director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. Your website? www.advocatesforpregnantwomen.org. And thank you for joining us in Women's History Month as well, 2 women who are making history. As we turn now to Chile to speak with another woman, unfortunately, about the horror that's taken place in Chile. The death toll from Saturday's massive earthquake has reached close to 800 and is expected to rise. An estimated 2 million people were affected by the earthquake, which was the worst disaster to hit Chile in half a century. Aid is yet to reach many areas hardest hit by the quake, including the southern city of Concepcion, which accounts for nearly half the death toll. Officials estimate that between 100 to 500 people in the city are still missing. Many residents are short of food and have seen their water and electricity supplies cut off. Security in the city remains a key concern after shops and homes were looted Monday and police made a large number of arrests. Chilean President Michelle Bachelet deployed some 14,000 troops to the area, and an 18-hour curfew has been imposed. One city resident called on Bachelet to come to Concepcion herself instead of sending soldiers.
She should come. She should come here. We need help. We don't have anything here. We are wearing borrowed clothes. We have nothing. We need help.
Meanwhile, President Bachelet has held a news conference with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who arrived in Santiago and pledged U.S. support. Bachelet, who will be replaced by President-elect Sebastián Piñera in 2 weeks, said reconstruction would be costly.
There are international experts who have spoken of $30 billion US, but really we believe that we need to have more information to be able to do a complete cost analysis. One of the topics I have discussed with Secretary of State Clinton is the possibility to look, and I will discuss this with the President-elect as well, the possibility to count on funds or credit on favorable terms, to be able to begin the reconstruction, which is going to take a long time and be very expensive.
Many Chileans have complained that scores of deaths could have been avoided had the government responded faster. The earthquake set off a tsunami a few hours later that killed many who survived the quake. Despite the devastation, many say the human and economic costs could have been a lot worse given the size of the earthquake, one of the strongest ever recorded in history. In fact, scientists say the 8.8 magnitude quake was so powerful it slightly shifted the Earth's axis and shortened the day by 1.26 microseconds. At a briefing at UN headquarters in New York, UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Chief for Humanitarian Affairs Catherine Bragg said the disaster could have been far worse.
Yes, the country is very well prepared. It has one of the strongest building codes, but at the same time, I don't think any country can be prepared for an 8.8 earthquake totally adequately. It is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the 5th most severe earthquake ever recorded in human history. So no matter how prepared you are, there are going to be repercussions from something as big as this. It is true that there are some hospitals that are damaged, some that have collapsed. That's why the government is asking for field hospitals to be put in as the very targeted requirements that they have asked the international community to help with, because they do determine that it is an area that is needed.
For the latest news, we go now to Chile. We're joined by Eva Salinas, the editor of the Santiago Times. She's speaking to us from Santiago. Welcome to Democracy Now! You're not at the epicenter, Eva, of the earthquake, but tell us what you have seen, what have you been reporting, what has the Santiago Times been printing?
Hi there. Well, as you just mentioned, we're about 6 hours, what normally is a 6-hour drive to the epicenter. But of course, Santiago is still affected, and it's unbelievable, the spin-off really from within the city here. What we're seeing is, of course, there was minimal damage to a lot of buildings and severe damage to a few. But what's happening on the outskirts of Santiago, anyway, is a lot of safety and security concerns within some of the poorer comunas, the neighborhoods where there normally aren't a lot of police, and so there's a lot of looting of shops. There's one neighborhood in particular that I've spoken to some residents there that are keeping watch all night long, bonfires on the end of every street because they're still out of power. And this is in Santiago, so all the way down to where the earthquake has hit hardest. It's about a 500-kilometer span where there's been damage and are really, really feeling some strong effects of the quake. Now, right in the center, near the epicenter, Concepcion, Constitucion, Talca, right on the Pacific coast there, communication has been really, really difficult. It's impossible to call by phone, and I did manage to speak with someone there yesterday in Concepcion. He's working as a translator. He told me that it's not maybe a matter of communication in that, you know, the networks are down, even though the electricity is down, but no one can recharge their phone. Maybe all the cell phones are dead just because, you know, they've been out of power since Saturday. But I was able to get in touch with him. He said right now that, you know, when the military descended on Monday, because of all the looting that was going on, it did put a stop to it quite quickly. But there is a curfew in place from 6 p.m. until 12 noon. Most of the arrests are simply because people are out without police permission. So I think the violence and the looting has calmed down. Some of the buildings that were set on fire by looters Sunday and Monday are still burning. People are separated from their families. A lot have moved up onto the hills without water, without food. It's, you know, day 4. They haven't been reached by aid. They don't really know what's going on. So there's an eerie stillness to Concepcion where about 15% of the buildings have actually completely collapsed, and many are on their last legs.
Eva Salinas, what about Bachelet's decision to deploy 14,000 troops to Concepcion?
Well, I think it has helped in terms of the security and safety of the city. Certainly the looting and the bit of the chaos that initially ensued didn't help, you know, to comfort people, but it's not feeding anyone. You know, the necessities that are needed, the water and food, that's still really, really slow to get down there. I think there is a bit of a fear. People, just talking to a lot of people are a bit concerned and puzzled why that took so long. I don't know if it's because there's a fear to be affiliated with of course, the Pinochet era and the military dictatorship, but that's certainly a very strong sentiment in the country, and that runs really, really deep. So I don't know if that was a fear to bring in those troops right away. Of course, the same Navy went to Haiti so quickly, and, you know, took a while to get down there Saturday and Sunday, even to notify those who about the tsunami, of course, which I think could have been expected much, much quicker. Even more powerful earthquake hit in 1960 with a huge tsunami that followed immediately afterwards. So this is a country that has experienced this before and experienced worse.
Finally, what this means in the context of the changing administrations, Michelle Bachelet going out, and that call for her to go to Concepcion?
I'm not sure what it would do for her to go to Concepcion. You know, certainly her presence, she's had a very high approval rating as she leaves office. It's been over 80%. So I think in general people feel comforted by her. The fact that the government's in transition is a huge concern, and I think it's a very unique case in that there are fears, for instance, that are the current members of, for instance, the National Emergency Service, are they giving their 100% when in 1 week's time they may lose their job? So it's going to be very interesting, and we're going to be watching really closely to see how they make that transition. You have President Bachelet going down, you have President-elect Piñera going down. What kind of promises are they both making, and how do you transfer power, and how do you transfer the position such as the Minister of Health to someone who doesn't have perhaps a political background and who's taking on the job for the first time? And I don't know how that's done. It is a big concern, and everyone is going to be watching that really closely.
Eva Salinas, I want to thank you for joining us, editor of the Santiago Times, speaking to us from Santiago, Chile. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We'll be back in a minute.
Dímelo, 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 dímelo. Hoy es martes, creo, bajo el sol nada nuevo. Ansío mirar el cielo y solo veo rasgo el cielo. Mi pie izquierdo me mira con esa sonrisa entre línea y enseguida empieza uno de esos días de los que prefieres borrar del calendario, que parecen un calvario de lo fome y rutinario. El mismo uniforme uniformado puesto por todo el vecindario. ¿Será necesario vestirse así a diario? Mientras el diario es su portada, otra modelo enamorada de un famoso con la labia. Pero yo sigo en la fila del metro con la esperanza de un boleto que me lleve ya al desierto, ya que solo tengo mi pie izquierdo con la mala suerte en los bolsillos y sin dinero. Camino sin ruta con la esperanza de una suerte que cambie mi destino para empezarla ya otra vez.
Me equivoqué, no sé por qué, no quiero volver por ese camino. Será otra vez, quizás tal vez debería seguir mi propio destino.
Pie Izquierdo by Anita Tijoux, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Britain, lawmakers have voted in favor of a bill to restrict so-called vulture funds. That is, financiers that buy up poor country debts cheaply and then sue for massive profits. The debt relief bill would pave the way for banning private investors from pursuing the world's poorest countries for debts in British courts. Over the last 5 years, the British, the United States, the countries have written off billions of dollars in loans to the world's poorest countries. But a group of vulture funds have been trying to divert that money into their own pockets. Investigative journalist Greg Palast traveled to the West African country of Liberia to investigate how vulture funds have been operating there and why Liberia lost a $20 million case against 2 vulture funds in a British court. He filed this report for the BBC.
Welcome to Liberia in West Africa, where 80% of the people survive on less than $1 a day. Now, these people are being told that they have to pay $28 million to a bunch of financial speculators known as vulture funds. This was not supposed to happen.
Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great and end to the debt crisis for the poorest countries.
Over the past 5 years, Nelson Mandela led a very successful campaign to get rich nations to forgive the debt of poor nations. The West wrote off billions of dollars. Just as Britain, Europe, and America were about to pay off all of Liberia's debts, down swooped vultures who put their claws on the money. They were waving worthless sheets of paper, old debts that they had picked up for next to nothing. And now they were demanding that these Liberians pay them 10 times, even 100 times what the vultures themselves had paid for this worthless junk. There was outrage.
I would say to them, do you know you're causing babies to die all over Liberia? Do you know you are making it almost impossible for this country to get back on its feet?
The blackmail that's going on here is, if somebody doesn't pay us something that we want, we're going to hold up the development of the Liberian economy.
Where's their conscience? What do they say as a conscience? They don't care.
So who are these vultures? Vultures collect on debts of the poorest nations, but they never lent these poor countries any money at all. So how did these American speculators get their hands on Liberia's debts?
We've come to the offices of Greylock Capital, big players in the industry.
Greylock CEO Hans Humes tells us how he ended up with some of Liberia's debts.
I ended up buying a lot of the loans that we had in Liberia. When I called one of the banks that was going through a merger 13, 14 years ago, I said, hey, by the way, you're a lender to this African country. And the guy said, no, I'm not. A couple of days later, he said, you know what, you're right. We found this box in this warehouse that had files for all these loans. Do you want to buy all of them?
The reason Hans and other speculators were able to buy up Liberia's debt dirt cheap was war. In the 80s and 90s, Liberian warlords were chopping the country into bloody pieces, killing 1 in 10 Liberians. Humes and others were willing to wait until peace could be restored, but for some vultures, Liberia's misery was an opportunity.
4,500 miles away from the mayhem, they file a lawsuit in this courthouse in New York City. Now, Liberia didn't really have a government. It was run by a bunch of warlords under UN sanctions. Not surprisingly, Liberia doesn't show up in the courthouse, and they lose automatically when the judge issues this default judgment requiring the nation to pay $23 million.
Who is behind this lawsuit? The key figure is Eric Herman, the owner of Vulture fund FH International. And here he is at a chandelier-lit gala. Herman refused several requests to be interviewed, so we went to his office to ask why he sued war-torn Liberia. But his office seemed to have vanished.
Are they not there? They were there the other day. I'm sorry.
The nameplate's gone. There's someone in there. Hello?
Hi, can I help you guys?
Yeah, hi. Greg Palast, BBC Television, Montreux Capital. It's Mr. Herman's firm.
Guys,
yes?
They don't want to be interviewed. They don't want to be seen. So we're going to have to ask you to leave the building.
Okay. And do you know why they took the sign off their door?
I have no clue.
But we had a clue. He was at his huge gated estate. But we couldn't get close. In the village of Demay, houses are a bit smaller. These Liberians are rebuilding their homes with mud bricks they made themselves.
You're not paid?
Yes, you're just a volunteer.
You're volunteering?
Yeah.
For the community?
Yes.
Rebuilding Howa Murphy's home costs just $100 for supplies like cement. Howa is a young donut baker. Her grandfather was beaten to death in front of her during Liberia's long civil war, and every house in the village was destroyed. Now, nameless vultures are fighting to take $28 million from the Liberians, enough to rebuild 250,000 homes. The village elder says it's an unfair fight.
It's like someone that is amputated, and you say, come and fight me. How can I fight? You tell me, you got 2 arms, I got no arms, and you expect me to fight you.
This is not a fight Liberians were expecting, because in 2007, all of Liberia's creditors, including Eric Herman, agreed to accept just 3 cents on the dollar for all that nation's debts. Then it emerged that Eric Herman had quietly transferred his part of the debt to a secretive fund called HAMSA. Under the 3-cent deal, Herman would have received $1 million. But now, HAMSA sued in London for more. And that's how Liberia ended up getting hit with this $28 million judgment. Insider Humes was stunned at what he considers such gaming of the debt reduction process.
All they're trying to do is exploit the system, hold the system hostage to get some sort of excessive returns.
Liberian diplomat Winston Tubman is infuriated.
We see a lot of this in the world. People who sell drugs to kids, people who give arms to child soldiers to go and do what they did here in Liberia. There are people who put making a buck above everything else.
Britain's parliament agrees. They voted last Friday to ban vultures from their courts.
I say bravo. We've been waiting for a parliament or an assembly to take this kind of hard decision. To be able to bring these funds into reason.
Liberia's President, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf.
Maybe the U.S. Congress and maybe, some others in Europe will pick up this gauntlet and will follow the example of Britain and move that, because it's just so unfair to poor countries.
Today,
With the end of war, things are looking up for Liberia. There's a surge in literacy. Hopes are rising. But it's all threatened by lawsuits by vultures. The president has a message for them.
Look, here's a country having 2 decades of turmoil, of death and destruction. Now trying to find its way back, trying to give its young people a future. You should not be the one to become an obstacle towards the achievement of this. Have a conscience and give this country a break.
That report from investigative journalist Greg Palast, those last words from the president of Liberia, the first woman president of Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Greg Palast joining us here in New York. Welcome to Democracy Now! Further expand on what we watched here and listened to.
The interesting thing was we almost blew the story because I was working with, gonzo journalists Rick Rowley and Jackie Suin, and they saw our car from the stakeout in front of this Vulture's house. And
this is in New York.
This is in New York, Harrison, New York. This is where these vultures come from. These are where these speculators operate from. And what happened was they got the word, they figured out that we were staking them out, so at his big palatial house, that entire Liberian village could literally fit in his house. We measured it, the square footage. And we went to his office. By the time we got to his office, the Vulture, this is a $1 billion Vulture fund, had removed the plaques from the office wall. It's just outside of New York. Removed the plaques from the office wall, removed the suite numbers, and locked all their employees inside. And that, when we ran that report last Thursday in Britain, the next day, Britain outlawed Vulture funds. They said, if you are so ashamed of your work that you rip the plaques off your walls and hide inside, you shouldn't have access to the British courts. But then, of course, how come they have access to the U.S. courts? That's what we have to move on now.
When you aired a piece on Vulture funds on Democracy Now! In 2007. Congressman Conyers saw the piece, and he took the issue. He's going to see President Bush that day.
That's right. He went and took it. Congressman Conyers and Payne saw the report on Democracy Now! And they went right from the report right into George Bush's office, in the Oval Office, and said, what is this stuff? What are these vultures who are basically sucking down and siphoning off the aid money meant for the poorest nations on the planet? Bush said he would do something. I should say the last guy, Goldfinger, these guys, you have to understand, they buy up debt for nothing. They haven't lent anyone anything. They buy up the debt for like a penny on the dollar, and then they sue for 200 or 300 cents on the dollar, and sometimes they use, in the case of Zambia, they use bribery, intimidation, hiring Henry Kissinger as a lobbyist, whatever it takes to squeeze these countries and basically grab what was supposed to be aid money for these countries. Now, Britain has outlawed this, saying that you cannot attack these poor countries. If there's a deal with the IMF, you have to go along with the deal. You cannot seize the aid money. Why can't we do that in the United States? In fact, Maxine Waters has put in a bill to do just that.
It's interesting. The Supreme Court Monday rejected an appeal by bondholders seeking a piece of Argentina's U.S.-based pension assets. Argentina said the petitioners were vulture funds that bought the distressed sovereign debt of at a deeply discounted rate in order to speculate in litigation against the country.
Yeah.
So that happened in the Supreme Court, a positive decision.
We have some better rules in the U.S., and what happened there is that, look, Argentina was being ripped off by usurious interest rates and really being jammed by speculators. And now they want to seize. Now these guys have taken the debt, bought it for pennies on the dollars, and want to seize literally the social security system of the nation of Chile. At least the U.S. Supreme Court, of Argentina. At least the Supreme Court has said no to that.
We only have 30 seconds. What do you think President Obama should do?
He has the right under the U.S. Constitution to say, you cannot use our courts. That's unique to the U.S. Constitution, nowhere else. He should put down the rule, you cannot rip off, you cannot steal our aid money that was supposed to go to the world's poorest nation, and then move on. The Waters bill, the anti-vulture bill.
And that bill says?
And that bill says that basically the British rule, which George Bush had rejected, which says you cannot collect more money than has been accepted by the other creditors and the IMF. No more vulture speculation. It can end.
Greg Palast, thank you for joining us. That does it for our show. Website democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.